Okay, so hi. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today with us. Before I begin, I just want to say a huge word of appreciation to Dr. Sam Hurst. I know I speak for myself and many, many others when I say that we are very grateful for all of the labor and the dedication that goes into maintaining this very valuable platform. So thank you. And thanks so much to those of you who were able to donate today for earthquake relief in Syria and Turkey. I just want to provide a short content warning before I dive in. So today I'll be speaking about the death of adults and children with passing references to domestic violence, suicide, murder, psychiatric hospitals, and mental health. And what I mean by passing references are brief mentions of those themes. Normally, when I describe the plot of a film, there won't be in-depth analysis or images of those subjects. But please take care and feel free to step away at any time. And just by way of introduction, I'd like to tell you a little bit briefly about how I arrived at this research. I have a strong interest in how dance, theater, and film intersect in Japanese culture, and much of what links them is rooted in supernatural folklore and spiritual traditions. I have spent time in Tokyo and Yokohama training in Japanese movement arts, as well as researching in the archives of Waseda University's Theater Museum. And I have benefited from learning about Shinto from a Shinto priest in training with whom I visited many Shinto shrines and sacred areas in Honshu. Some of this research appears in my book, Ju-on the Grudge, published in the Devil's Advocates series. But I'm really happy today to be continuing the discussion with a specific focus on Shinto and Buddhist influences and within a wider scope of Japanese supernatural horror. So the films that I've chosen to discuss today are widely available. That means they're distributed internationally and they're available subtitled. It's certainly not an exhaustive selection of films, far from it, but I'm going to hop among diverse film eras and subgenres in order to look broadly at how the supernatural and Japan's two main religions intersect. I'm sorry to disappoint anime fans. I won't be addressing any animated films today. I feel that that's a very broad category that deserves its own specific study, although much of what I say today will also apply to anime films that feature supernatural themes. So I hope that this talk will provide an introduction to some of the Shinto and Buddhist themes running throughout Japanese supernatural horror and how they manifest in diverse ways, from providing an overall theme or structure to specific actions and motifs, as well as a lens through which we might understand the nature of the horrific in Japanese supernatural films. Alongside our intellectual understanding of a film and its themes, I believe our sensorial experience of a film is equally important, and I will provide some examples of how Shinto and Buddhist concepts generate aesthetics that allow for the senses, to come to the fore in Japanese supernatural horror. There are additional influences and themes that are important in many of the films discussed today, but I will be focusing specifically on Japanese spiritual traditions and how the supernatural are connected. I'm also aware that when we speak about religion, we paint it with a very broad brush because, of course, every individual experience of religion is different and very difficult to quantify. But just to provide some basic facts about religion and spirituality in Japan today, I wanted to mention that religious freedom is guaranteed in the Japanese Constitution. That's been the case since the post-war period, World War II. The majority of the country is affiliated with Shinto, and for the reasons I've just mentioned, it can be very difficult to get a precise number because what do we mean by being affiliated with Shinto? And I'll dive into that very shortly. But let's just say, for the purposes of most statistics, that we arrive at a very overwhelming majority of the country that does affiliate with Shinto in some way, and that inspires a specific belief in the spirit world that I'll touch upon soon. So that number is usually upwards of 80 to 95%, which is a very large percentile for a country. There are also large numbers of the population affiliated with Buddhism, different schools of Buddhism. That number usually wavers between 45 to 67%, but it's a very important point to mention that most Buddhists in Japan are following some practice related to Shinto and Buddhism both simultaneously. To provide just a little more information about other groups in the population of Japan, there is animism that is practiced in indigenous groups, such as the Ainu of Hokkaido, that's in northern Japan. Officially, the population of the Ainu is at around 20,000 individuals. Unofficially, that number goes up sometimes to 100,000 individuals. The animism practiced by the Ainu is very similar to that of Shintoism, as we'll see soon, and there are many terms that are fluid across the two groups. Immigration and globalization today have resulted in minority religions. Contact with the West in particular has shown a growing number of Christians in Japan, but the minority is still rather low at 1 to 3%. And also immigrant groups make up a small portion of individuals who practice Hindu religion and Islam. These are not really religions per se, but I did want to mention that Chinese Confucianism, astrology, feng shui, and other Chinese folk practices are also important in Japanese culture, and at different periods have represented important codes of ethics and cultural influences that are still there in this rather rich and complex tapestry of the country. So I'm going to provide more information soon about Shinto and Buddhist beliefs, but first I'd like to establish the early links between Japan's two main religions and the supernatural on screen. I'd like to first look at free cinematic devices and theater for a moment, including the Utsushi-e, a Japanese-style magic lantern that enjoyed immense popularity in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly via phantasmagoria projection shows. Waseda University's Utsushi-e archive notes that, quote, ghost stories were the most popular programs performed at schools, theaters, or temples, and often adapted kabuki dance drama or bunraku puppet plays. The Japanese take on the magic lantern included hand-painted slides and could be manipulated by sliding glass or using mechanisms controlled by threads. This combined older shadow puppet theater techniques with new projection technology to animate ghosts and other supernatural creatures. The projector often generated tricks. A black cloth background, such as the one seen in this image, could be used to create quick appearances and disappearances, as well as other special effects like lightning. Operators with projectors in their hands would move freely behind the screen, changing the location and size of the images, pioneering future animation techniques, and generating marvel through the use of zooms, fade-ins, fade-outs, and cuts. In addition to the role of temples in hosting these Utsushi-e showings, this PowerPoint image provides an early example of how Utsushi-e slides merged supernatural and spiritual motifs. We see an animated daruma here. Daruma dolls are a common sight in Japan and represent Bodhidharma, the Buddhist monk credited with transmitting Zen Buddhism to China, which would then make its way to Japan. He is normally represented without arms or legs because his limbs are said to have fallen off from prolonged meditation. In Japan, daruma, or Bodhidharma dolls, can be bought at temples for luck. They are a common talisman for perseverance, and they are sold without eyes. When one states a goal, they fill the left eye in, and when that goal has been realized, they fill in the other. At the end of the year, daruma are burned in a Buddhist temple ceremony. The slide depicts a wide-eyed, animated daruma with both legs and arms in a story called Daruma no Yobai, a popular play from the Edo period, an era that spans the years 1603 to 1867. In the play, a man hangs a painting of Daruma that he has recently purchased at an antique shop. When he leaves home for a fireworks display, Daruma comes alive and jumps from the painting, helping himself to a nearby bottle of sake, Japanese rice wine. Daruma has a naughty romp outside the painting and reflects the Shinto belief that inanimate objects that have attained 100 years of age can become lively, animated spirits. Similarly, the one-eyed umbrella or parasol, known as kasa obake, is featured prominently in Kimiyoshi Yasada's 1968 film Yokai Monsters, 100 Monsters. The Daruma and kasa obake demonstrate that Japanese representations of the supernatural are not limited to the demonic or terrifying, though such vengeful spirits certainly exist, most famously Sadako and Kayako. They are also often comedic or simply bizarre, creating a curious or eerie mood. This reflects the supernatural tales anthologized in the popular Kwaidan collection made famous in the West by Lafcadio Hearn's English translation at the end of the 19th century. While most non-Japanese translations of Kwaidan simply use the term ghost story, the Japanese word is composed of two ideograms or characters, and the first means strange or mysterious. Dan, the second, refers to narrative. Whether frightening or simply bizarre, the yokai, or Japanese supernatural creatures, demonstrate that life forces may be embodied by demons, deities, non-human animals, humans, and inanimate objects in acts of revenge, naughtiness, silliness, benevolence, or protection. Going even further back in time, ritual dances performed as an offering to the deities of Shinto in ancient times developed into dance drama that drew on supernatural tales, resulting in No theater, the oldest form of Japanese dance drama still in performance today, dating back to the 14th century. Performances originally took place at shrines and temples, as they were intended as tools to relay religious teachings. No's earlier relationship to Shinto is evidenced in its Shinto-style stage, featuring a back wall painted with a sacred pine, believed to reference the Yogo pine at Nara's Kasuga shrine. According to legend, an old man was seen dancing beneath the tree, which was revealed to be the spirit of the shrine in human form. This recalls No's connecting bond between humans and kami, the spirits. Ritual dance drama realizes a magical moment of transformation when the spirit world is revealed. Later, kabuki dance drama arrived in the 16th century and is thought to have originated with a female Shinto shrine dancer. In both No and kabuki, there are genres of plays dedicated to the supernatural, including No's Mugen Mono, plays focused on phantoms and dream states, and Onimono, demon stories. Many such plays have been developed into supernatural horror films, but the two dance theater traditions have also influenced cinema in other ways, particularly in their function as a liminal space between the spirit and human realms, alongside non-linear descriptions of dream time, which we see in the early silent film A Page of Madness from 1926, as well as Kaneto Shindo's cult classic Onibaba from 1964, and later in Takashi Miike's 2014 feature Over Your Dead Body. A Page of Madness is an avant-garde description of psychological horror with supernatural undertones directed by Tenosuke Kinugasa, a kabuki performer turned filmmaker. The silent film depicts a hellish mental asylum, and it is the first Japanese film to use a subjective point of view, a sensory experience that transports the viewer directly to the film's bleak location. During a violent downpour, a man wanders the halls of the asylum. Due to his cruelty, his wife has had a breakdown, and out of guilt, he has taken a job as the institution's janitor. When his daughter announces her engagement, he is afraid for her, due to the era's wide-held belief that all mental illnesses were inherited. He gradually loses his hold on reality and slips into a dreamlike fantasy of spiriting his wife away, of killing the ward's doctor, of gifting his daughter a large dowry, and finally distributing smiling masks from the No Theater to all of the incarcerated patients. By the film's end, it is unclear where reality begins and dreams end, and whether the man's ill deeds are being punished via supernatural intervention or by his own understanding of karma, all of which can be linked to the spiritual structure of no plays via Shinto beliefs and Buddhist concepts. Onibaba, set during the 15th century upheaval of a Japanese civil war, features a female demon or Hanya no mask. Inspired by a Buddhist parable entitled Mask with Flesh Attached, a mother devastated by the death of her son is angry when her daughter-in-law begins a new sexual relationship. Disguised in the mask and a dead samurai's clothing, the mother scares her daughter-in-law at night, attempting to frighten her away from her new lover. As the film progresses, the older woman is unable to remove the mask, and it becomes stuck in the rain. Confessing her disguise to her daughter-in-law, she begs for help. When the mask is finally removed with great effort and the aid of a wooden mallet, the old woman's face has become horribly disfigured, and her daughter-in-law believes that she has truly become a demon, echoing the transformations of No Theater and Shinto shapeshifting. Unable to convince her daughter-in-law of her humanity, the two women leap to their deaths down a well, whose water may purify the mother-in-law's harmful deeds, according to Shinto's purification rites, or evoke the subterranean hells of Buddhism. Over Your Dead Body is set within a theater production of a well-loved 19th century kabuki play, the Yatsuya Kaidan, or the Tale of Oiwa, Japan's most iconic vengeful ghost. Oiwa's husband murders her, dumps her body in the river, and takes up with a new lover. He is haunted by the vengeful spirit that Oiwa becomes. Her story has graced artworks, written accounts, and inspired numerous other films, including Keisuke Kinoshita's 1949 adaptation, Matsaki Mori's version in 1956, quickly followed by Kinji Misumi's take on the tale in 1959, and Yasushi Kato's The Ghost of Oiwa in 1961. There are more, but I think you can appreciate the frequency with which Oiwa's story resurfaces. Mike's recent version features a play within a film, and the boundaries between art and life grow fuzzy, with love morphing into a grudge. Like a certain Scottish play that is said to be cursed in the West, Oiwa's story carries similar warnings for theater and film creatives in real life, inspiring graveside visits to the Tokyo burial site of the vengeful ghost who lived a human life in the 17th century. Those wishing to tell her story request permission to do so at her graveside and participate in religious purifying rituals to appease the curse associated with her story. The aforementioned films are strong examples of how dance lends supernatural horror a strong kinesthetic effect via the physical presence of ghosts and other supernatural entities transmitted through movement. In the slide, we see Kayako from The Grudge, and of course there's Sadako in the upper right-hand corner from The Ring. Supernatural and spiritual traditions have been firmly anchored in the arts since ancient times, developing from Shinto dance into No and Kabuki theater, the magic lantern, and then film, all paving the way for modern Japanese horror cinema. Jizo the Spook, made in 1898, and Resurrection of a Corpse from the same year, were not only two of Japan's first film productions, they are also two of the world's oldest horror films on record, written by Eijiro Hata. Although both are sadly considered lost, the film's photographer was able to provide testimony before his death regarding Resurrection of a Corpse, a narrative that depicts the recently deceased fallen from his coffin and returned to life, a contagion theme related to death that I'll explore in more detail later. Hata's other early film, Jizo the Spook, Bake Jizo, was likely based on the Japanese legend of Jizo statues, the guardian deity of children and travelers, protecting them from malevolent yokai. Because they are associated with the earth, Jizo statues are made out of stone, which possesses spiritual power for protection and longevity, according to Shinto and Buddhist beliefs. Jizo statues are placed to honor deceased children and are also featured on pathways for travelers. The presence of the word bake in the film's Japanese title, which is a category of shape-shifting entities, may refer to a haunted Jizo statue. Jizo are featured in other films, including the Yokai Monsters trilogy from 1968 and 1969. In the first film, Yokai Monsters 100 Monsters, a film title inspired by Buddhist art depicting a night parade of 100 supernatural creatures, Jizo is one of the benevolent yokai, and it's not surprising that he features prominently on the poster for the third installment of the trilogy, along with ghosts, as its plot follows a little girl who is pursued by dangerous bandits and receives protection in sacred Shinto areas and Buddhist burial grounds. Not only is the character a child, but she is also traveling in search of her father and falls under the two main duties of the Jizo. The Japanese supernatural pantheon can feel like a bottomless well as deep as the one from which Sadako emerges in Ring. The continual regeneration of the Japanese supernatural that we observe across popular media reflects centuries of Shinto and Buddhist practices that inspire strong beliefs in spirits, as well as a very specific set of criteria to be respected regarding the deceased and what might go wrong if those death rites are not upheld. I'd like to give you a few key points now regarding each religion and how they intersect to help facilitate identifying certain traits that resurface regularly in supernatural horror. I'll begin with Shinto, Japan's oldest religion. The first written mention of Shinto was recorded in 8th century in the Nihon Shoki, or Chronicles of Japan, although its animist practices and beliefs are considered much older than those written records. So what exactly is Shinto? Once again, there's a large statistic that shows what extent the Japanese population feels or identifies as being affiliated with Shinto. And this might take the form of belief in the kami. I'll talk very soon about who the kami are, but the kami are sacred spirits in Shinto. This might take the form of regular shrine visits, participation in matsuri, which are festivals with religious and folkloric origins. Shinto weddings are still rather popular in Japan, not quite as popular as Western-style weddings today, but some couples do choose to proceed with a religious wedding. As far as we know, Shinto is really unique to Japan. It's not a religion that has been proselytized outside Japan. The one exception is Hawaii because of its large Japanese immigrant population. Shinto is classified as a nature religion. It's animist and polytheist. In contrast to many of the world's major religions, it doesn't have a founding figure. It doesn't have a sacred text or fixed prayers. It was a state religion for quite some time in Japan, from the Meiji period up until World War II. That's the period at which I mentioned earlier freedom of religion was written into the Japanese constitution. But some people even argue about this category of calling it a religion. Some argue that it's a way, a custom, or a tradition. International religious studies scholars identify it as a religion nonetheless, but it's actually in the translation of the name Shinto, which actually translates to way of the kami, a word that may possibly be borrowed from the Ainu people in the north of Japan. So who are the kami and their entourage? Kami are spirits that inhabit all things and govern the natural world. The object of worship in Shinto from ancient times, kami are the qualities of growth, fertility, production, natural phenomena such as wind and thunder, natural objects such as the sun, mountains, rivers, trees, and rocks, animals, and ancestral spirits. It would be difficult to overestimate the importance of kami and the belief in spirits that is widespread in Japanese society, which extends to a common belief in ghosts and a deep respect for nature, inspiring specific aesthetics and moods in art that demonstrate a deep reverence for the natural world, but one that may turn fearful as well due to the great power of the kami. This generates certain sensorial effects in Japanese supernatural horror, as well as in Japanese cinema at large, in which natural elements such as the power of the wind via sound or subtle movements carries deep meaning and may provoke feelings of beauty, nostalgia, fear, awe, or all of the above. In Shinto, there is no absolute deity that is the creator and ruler of all. Sokyo Ono notes in her book Shinto, The Kami Way, quote, "The creative function of the world is realized through the harmonious cooperation of the kami in the performance of their respective missions." Originally divine forces of nature, by the 8th century, there were over 300 categories of kami already mentioned. Kami have a duty, and people have a duty towards the kami, meaning that kami have specific jobs that they are to uphold as long as they are respected and revered by the population at large. This keeps a balance that may easily be put off if certain rights, if certain forms of respect are not practiced. Kami are invisible, they are mobile, and they can become wrathful when disregarded. Evolving kami, meaning the development of new kami, reflect social and political upheavals and the population's needs, but belief in the kami is a constant across the centuries. The kami are worshipped primarily at household shrines and public shrines. Household shrines are called kamidana, or spirit shelves, and public shrines are known as jinja, or place of the spirits. Today, there are around 90,000 public shrines in Japan. The latter were built in relation to nature or ancient clans that were considered pioneering families. Each shrine's primary purpose is to provide a dwelling for one or more of the designated kami in a single sanctuary or group of sanctuaries. Now, this may be a familiar image if you have watched quite a lot of Japanese supernatural horror, because the torii gate is one of the most prominent features to signify that we are entering into a Shinto shrine or sacred area. And what the torii does, the torii delineates the everyday world from the realm of the kami. So we know that once we pass under that gate, it is really the kami who are running the show. And that inspires a certain kind of energy, a certain spirit belief that may be immediately something we grasp in a Japanese supernatural film when we see that gate. And of course, like any style of architecture or religious building, they have evolved over time with different styles. But you'll see some of the torii gate designs here on the slide. Torii gates are normally red. Red is considered a very lucky color in Japan, and it's also used to dispel evil. So they're often red, but they may also be just plain wood. You see that as well. Aside from shrines, I also just wanted to mention the image that you see here with the beautiful boulders in the water. If there is a natural site that is already considered sacred, we may not even need the presence of the shrine to indicate the sacred nature of that site, which is the case here. But we do have other ornaments that are associated with Shinto worship, which I'll move on to next. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the architecture of a shrine, simply because it is so important in many of the Japanese supernatural titles that you may have seen. And for a Japanese viewer, They don't need any explanation. These are very everyday sites, but they have certain indications surrounding them that you may not have the codes to understand if you're not familiar with Shinto. So most shrines contain walls to protect the shrine area from desecration. Shrine entrances are always marked by the tori, as I have mentioned. Aside from some maybe very small wayside shrines, you will always see the tori. There's a special road or path leading up to a shrine known as the sando, which is the approach. This is very ceremonial in terms of the way that one approaches the realm of the kami. In fact, there are certain protocols for how one walks down that road. Traditionally, one is supposed to stay at the sides of the path so that the kami can use the center aisle to move in and out of the shrine area. You'll see a lot of guardians. Some of them are deva kings that are borrowed from Indian art, but you also see other types of animal protectors, such as dogs, lions, foxes, and deer. Earlier on the slide, we saw the kami Inari, who uses foxes as a messenger. So 1/3 of the shrines in Japan are dedicated to Inari. Inari is a very important figure, so we see a lot of foxes naturally on the site of those shrine compounds. Lanterns, memorial tablets, and sacred trees are also a common sight on shrine grounds. And the most important one that I wanted to speak about today is known as the mizuya, which is a purification area. Before entering a shrine, every person who visits will wash one hand and then the other with a wooden dipper that goes into the water basin. Now, at older shrines, this might be a natural source of water, a spring, but in most urban areas, you'll have a stone basin out of which people dip water. And once they've washed their hands, the idea is also to rinse the mouth out. And this is part of a much more complex set of protocols regarding purification that's extremely important in Shinto. But I really wanted to mention here right away the presence of water, the importance of water as something that will really purify and sort of counterbalance any type of negative situation. In fact, we can see it here in Spook Warfare, which is the second title in the Yokai Monsters trilogy. Here we have a natural spring, and you can see the water coming out of the bamboo pole, and then you actually see one of the Shinto wooden dippers in the foreground. And what we have on the slide is a kappa, who is a water kami and a yokai, who's usually depicted as being child-sized with webbed feet, a greenish color. So the kappa is usually depicted as reptilian or amphibian-like, and the kappa can become malevolent if not respected properly, but when befriended can perform many favors, including irrigation and medical services. Some of the objects of worship in Shinto that you may be familiar with from Japanese supernatural horror films include shimenawa, which is a sacred rope with paper zigzags indicating the sacred dwelling of the kami. There are also sometimes pieces of flax hanging down as well. You'll see these on the tori gates as well as inside the compound, and you may see them around sacred trees. So anytime you see these shimenawa, you know that the presence of the kami is indicated, and this can be a really strong visual cue in different supernatural horror films. Other common sites would include the gohei, which is a symbolic offering. You can see that image at the top, at the side of the image. It kind of looks like an offering with a little birdhouse on the bottom. So this is a symbolic offering that also indicates the presence of the kami, but you find this inside the sanctuary, not outside. The haraigushi is a purification wand that's handled by priests who wave it over people or objects in cleansing rituals. Again, the importance of cleansing and purification. You can see how important that is in Shinto. It comes up regularly. And the mirror is also an object of worship when it's hidden within the Shinto sanctuary, or as an ornament reflecting, quote, clean light, symbolizing the stainless mind of the kami, an embodiment of the fidelity of the worshiper towards the kami. And you can imagine that numerous folktales involve the kami and what one thinks one sees or doesn't see in the mirror inside the sanctuary. In Yoshiyuki Kurada's 1968 feature Yokai Monsters Spook Warfare, a Babylonian monster arrives in Japan and sucks the blood of a local samurai, taking over his body. The monster, now appearing as the samurai, proceeds to destroy the family Shinto and Buddhist altars. We see him strike the Shimenawa rope with his sword, dishonoring the kami, and invoking the wrath of the local yokai for his disrespect. The scene not only illustrates the vampiric monster's fear in the face of Shinto's purifying capabilities, it also underscores the disequilibrium wrought by a foreign invader, playing on the film's Edo period setting. During that era, Japan's status was known as sakoku, or locked country, which was an isolationist ideology that saw Japan's borders strictly controlled and mostly closed for over 200 years in order to limit foreign influence, particularly the threat that Spain and Portugal's Catholicism represented for Shinto, the national religion directly linked to the country's highest authority, the emperor, who is believed to be descended from the Shinto sun kami Amaterasu. One can easily draw parallels between the plot of Yokai Monsters Spook Warfare and the ways in which Bram Stoker's Dracula represented anti-Semitism in Victorian England. In the same film, the monster is quite thorough and also destroys the family's Buddhist altar, which brings me to Japanese Buddhism, because here we see the samurai destroying the Shinto altar. So Japanese Buddhism arrived from Korea via China in the 6th century. Of course, Buddhism was developed in India about 2,500 years ago, and it took over 1,000 years for Buddhism to travel the Silk Route and to arrive finally in Japan in the beginning as an offering from Korea. There are diverse schools and lineages of Japanese Buddhism. You may have heard of Pure Land and Zen as some of the most famous, but there are quite a few that might be affiliated with certain historic moments, those that are still active. Some of the schools are unique to Japan and are not practiced outside the country, whereas others might be more familiar because they have followings in neighboring countries as well. Early on, when Buddhism first arrived in China, there was a fear that the kami might be offended by the worship of Buddha. And so one clan, the Soga clan, was permitted to test worship of Buddha as an experiment to see if Shinto's kami would be angered. But in fact, this caused a lot of disruptions among other clans, and they used it to political means as well to begin a war. But the Soga clan that had been assigned to Buddhism triumphed in this war, and so Japanese Buddhism quickly spread to other regions of the country and became more commonplace. In the 8th century, Buddhist monks were invited to shrines to conduct Shinto rites. And so there was a real joining of both Buddhism's spiritual traditions and Shinto's spiritual traditions. The kami, Buddhas, and bodhisattvas became associates and avatars of one another. In terms of belief, Japanese Buddhism, like many other forms of Buddhism, promotes a belief in karma, which is a Sanskrit word meaning action, which has led to the belief that actions have consequences. There is a belief in reincarnation. And in contrast to Shinto, that promotes the idea that respect towards the kami will result in a balanced and peaceful life, in Buddhism, life is considered suffering, and working towards enlightenment is the only thing that will end this cycle of suffering and rebirths. Japanese Buddhist temples also practice purifying via water or incense at the temple entrance. So here you see Tokyo's Asakusa temple. And if you see the very small pagoda in the foreground, in the center, this is actually an incense pavilion where people will come and purify themselves before they move further into the temple sanctuary. But the most important aspect of Japanese Buddhism today is its funerary rites. 90% of the funerals in Japan are Buddhist. And there are a lot of beliefs about how that must happen, the funerary rites, because there is an entire protocol to be followed during what is considered a 49-day journey after dying. So during this period, the body it hasn't gone on to its next rebirth, but it's not alive either. And so it's traveling on a journey. And there are a lot of rules in terms of the deceased family, how they proceed in terms of how they remember their deceased loved one at the Buddhist altar at home. There are protocols regarding whether the Buddhist altar cabinet is kept open or closed. This is something you'll see a lot in supernatural horror films to indicate the death of someone in the family whose picture you might see on the altar. Funerals are supposed to be held at specific days, and there are specific actions to be taken on specific days. And there's a whole process in the afterlife of what's happening on this journey to the deceased, where they must figure out how to cross a certain river. It's almost the Japanese equivalent of the river Styx. And the idea of the Sanzu River is that there are different points where one crosses, and depending on how good a person one has been during their most recent lifetime, that will determine the crossing point and how difficult it is, whether one might walk across a bridge or whether one has to wade through water. So sometimes in Japanese supernatural horror films, you might see two parallel images, what's happening to the deceased in their post-mortem journey and what's happening to the family on their side in terms of the ceremony that they're holding, how they uphold those funeral rites, and if they're doing the right things. And of course, one is judged during this period to determine the next rebirth. It's important to note too that while I'll be speaking about a Buddhist vision of hell, in Japanese Buddhism, hell is not a permanent place. It's not an eternal resting place, but one does have to wait for the next life cycle to possibly be reborn elsewhere. And one can also be saved by prayers from those of the living, which earns a rebirth perhaps on earth or even in a heavenly realm, which once again explains some of those parallel images that we see at times in supernatural horror films, alternating between the deceased and their family's prayers. So here we see what the Buddhist home altar looks like, and you can see that there are doors that can be closed, and once again there are rules to follow about when those doors are closed and open. We see photographs of loved ones and offerings, and this is something that also accounts for a very fearful scene in Shimizu's Ju-on the Grudge. There's a moment when the schoolgirl is killed by Kayako, who actually appears from within the family's home altar. So in this very sacred, and one would assume purified space, a ghost has been able to penetrate that space and wreak her vengeance, which makes it all the more powerful in terms of this violent death that the vengeful ghost is going to enact. By the 19th century, Shinto and Buddhism had become so intertwined. Remember, I talked about the fact that Buddhist deities, Bodhisattva, Buddhas, and the kami had become avatars of one another. And the shrines and temples were actually indistinct at that point because one could worship both Buddhist and Shinto deities in both places. And Shinto and Buddhism had become so intertwined by the 19th century that shrines and temples were not distinguished as they are today. And in 1868, Japanese rulers sought to separate Shinto and Buddhism as two distinct religions, an act of separation known as Shinbutsu Bunri, thereby separating Shinto shrines from Buddhist temples and making sure that Buddhist names were not used as avatars for Shinto deities. This was a measure to undermine the wealth and influence of Buddhism and focus on the emperor, a direct descendant of the Shinto sun kami Amaterasu. Shinbutsu Bunri efforts relaxed within only a few years and ultimately failed. People were too attached to the funeral rites in particular to drop Buddhism so easily. And even today, shrines and temples maintain aspects of both religions, even if Shinto and Buddhism are now considered two independent religions. A widespread adage in Japan refers to, quote, living as Shintoists, dying as Buddhists. To provide an example of how religion or spiritual traditions seamlessly merge in Japanese life, I'd like to quote a recent article featured in the Japan Times at the end of 2022. The article is entitled, How Faith and Spirituality Shape Modern Japan, and begins with the following example. Yukari Nozawa doesn't think much about the myriad Shinto, Buddhist, and even Christian customs she follows. There's the Bon holidays in mid-August, for example, when she visits her family grave in Niigata Prefecture to honor the souls of her ancestors believed to return from the netherworld. She has been invited to Christian-style weddings and has attended Christmas Mass in the past, the latter out of curiosity. Just recently, she visited a Tokyo Shinto shrine for a purification ritual to dispel bad luck. And here, once again, returning to the film Yokai Monsters, Spook Warfare from 1968, when the daughter of the samurai whose body has been inhabited by the foreign monster is shocked to find their Shinto and Buddhist altars destroyed, she asks why this has happened. And she says, you respected and revered them just this morning, but you can see that they're used seamlessly in one sentence without any conflict between the two. Here we can also see a very interesting scene in the same film where a Buddhist monk comes and he's really trying to dispel this demon, this foreign monster, and he's actually practicing and saying out loud Buddhist sutras, and he has his Buddhist prayer beads in hand, but he's doing so in front of a Shinto altar. And I hope by now you can see that there is Shimenawa designating the presence of Kami in the image. Okay, oh, I think I missed a slide. Okay. Both Shinto and Buddhism in Japan promote the use of omamori, charms and talisman bags for protection and success. Different charms for different contexts and goals that can be purchased at shrines and temples, regardless of one's religious affiliation. Buddhist protection and sutras also exist through recalling scripture and through paper prayers. And one of the examples I appreciate a lot from Spook Warfare is when a small Buddhist prayer is used almost as a weapon, because these are the benevolent yokai, but for the foreign monster to get them out of the way, he instrumentalizes a Buddhist prayer, and you can see the calligraphy on the paper. It hits the kappa yokai on the head, and to the right we see he says, oh, that hurts, and it starts to burn. And then in fact the other yokai touch him and they attempt to help him, and because of their contact to him, all of them are being punished because of the touch of this paper that they're unable to contact, and it traps them within an urn. And you see that the prayer paper on top traps them in the urn. And because they are nice yokai, they kind of appeal to Lord Buddha, wondering what's happening. We also see this in Takashi Shimizu's 2021 film, Suicide Forest Village. During this time, when there's a haunting going on and strange things have begun to occur and the young people are not so sure what's going on, they go to the Buddhist temple, and here they're advised to recite the sutras. And for one night, they're going to pray and hope to drive away these evil spirits from a haunted box that's been bothering them. So these examples have come to demonstrate the concept of kegare. Kegare is a very important key concept for understanding supernatural horror. It means uncleanliness, and death is the primary source of kegare in Japanese belief. Kegare originated in Shinto belief, but it's widespread now across the country, and it affects Buddhists as well, or even non-believers who still culturally have integrated the concept of kegare into everyday life. I think it's important when I talk about uncleanliness to mention that it's not the Western equivalent of a sin or a moral judgment, but it is a force to be reckoned with and that has to be treated very carefully with care. And the way to reverse kegare is through proper purification procedures. For example, after Buddhist funerals, attendees are given salt to purify themselves to avoid contaminating others. Contact with kegare can be passed on to family and community members, and this explains the strong theme of contagion that's reflected in Japanese horror from 1898 to the present. Remember, why would a body falling out of a casket represent such fear in the first horror film is because this contact with the dead must be handled very carefully according to cultural beliefs. There are many, many purifying rituals in Shinto as well, such as the one described in the Japan Times article, in which the woman explains how she participated in a purification ritual at a Shinto shrine to dispel bad luck. So purifying rituals counteract kegare, and failure to do so can result in mayhem and misfortune, demonstrated in yokai monsters, Ju-on, Ring, the Oiwa retellings, and Suicide Forest Village, just to name a few. And I should mention that contact with the dead extends to ghosts, hence these precautions in dealing with ghosts and spiritual figures. Hoichi the Earless is an 18th century folktale documented in Iseike Seiken's 1782 collection of strange tales, followed by Lafcadio Hearn's famous translation in the 19th century. The story was adapted for the screen in Masake Kobayashi's 1964 Kwaidan, an anthology film featuring 4 distinct stories. Hoichi is a blind biwa or lute player and a temple attendant. One evening, he is approached by the ghost of a samurai who requests that he come play the biwa and sing for his lord magistrate. Hoichi obliges and begins chanting the epic tale of the Heike for a spectral court. As the musical piece is long, Hoichi agrees to return the following evening to continue the performance. Noticing his absence, a priest asks Hoichi where he goes at night, but the musician won't say and has been sworn to secrecy. One night, his friends follow him and learn that he's been playing in the graveyard. Fearful for his safety, the priest and his acolyte paint the Heart Sutra across Hoichi's body, including its celebrated lines, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form," explaining that it will make him invisible to the ghosts. But like an Achilles' heel, they neglect to paint his ears, and when the phantom samurai comes to fetch Hoichi, he sees only the musician's ears. The spectral samurai tears them from Hoichi's body to show his lord magistrate that he has obeyed orders to seek the musician. Supernatural episodic films like Kwaidan or Ju-on the Grudge not only recall the Edo period's popular 100 ghost story parties, which friends would host when friends would host an entertaining evening of 100 ghost tales accompanied by a purifying Shinto ceremony to ensure that the stories did not spill over into real life. They also provide a structure inspired by Buddhism's concept of cyclical time and reincarnation. Ju-on the Grudge opens with the lines explaining that those who encounter the curse die and a new curse is born. Dividing the film into 6 segments underpins the short lifespan of the victims for whom each episode is named, including Kayako herself. The episode functions like links in a chain, creating a circular narrative of events. Scrambling past, present, and future further enhances the film's cyclical motif. By moving forward in the film, we return to the past, unveiling the karmic nature of the curse in the final episode, when Kayako's murder at the hands of her violent husband is revealed. She is literally reborn, emerging from Rika, the protagonist's body, before the crime is replayed in flashback mode. Visually, the cyclical nature of time and ongoing malice is represented historically in water wheels or spinning wheels, such as the one depicted in the Kwaidan's opening episode, Black Hair, that features a wife abandoned by her husband who patiently spins, waiting for his return. When he finally does return years later, he finds her unchanged at her spinning wheel. The next morning, however, he wakes next to a corpse and realizes that it was all an illusion, a very Buddhist theme. The house is dilapidated. His wife's long hair physically haunts him, independent of her skeletal corpse. Like the threads spun on her wheel, strands of hair are all that remain. He stumbles and falls next to the house's well, seeing his reflection in the water before dying. Images of wells are common in Japanese horror and not only recall the purifying effects of water in Shinto, they also serve as a visual reference to Buddhist hell, which, as I mentioned earlier, is known as jugoku and contains multiple hot and cold layers that are depicted in various historic works of art. Images of hell and its subterranean bureaucracy were omnipresent in temples, festivals, illustrated stories, and dance drama performances. Hiroshi Takahashi, Ring's scriptwriter, has spoken about the film's iconic ghost Sadako and her climb out of the well in which she was thrown down. In an interview, when a journalist commented that hell seemed to be at the center of the scriptwriter's preoccupations, Takahashi replied, "I think about it all the time. I'm always scared of going to hell, but it's not a Christian hell. I have the feeling that if we dig down in the earth several hundred meters, we would find a place like hell. What haunts me is this spot is connected to the real world. During Obon, the festival of the dead, we go to the cemetery to honor the ancestors. As it's in August, it's very hot, it's very sunny, and we pour water on the gravestones. That this water connects two worlds, it's part of the same idea that I find terrifying and adds to my fear of being pulled towards these hells that are located beneath the ground. The well and ring recalls the idea of this vertical world." End quote. Another early example in yokai monsters' spook warfare includes the Babylonian monster being disposed of in a nearby spring. As the monster descends into the water, it bubbles and turns red, not only evoking a hot, hellish realm below, but signifying that the color red used to dispel evil in Japan is currently at work. As in numerous other examples, the water is also a purifying agent sought to counteract the evil at hand. So to conclude, I'd just like to mention a few differences perhaps between the ways that religion is used in Japanese supernatural horror and Western horror, because I think most of us here today are primarily Western viewers with that background. So compared to Western horror that often illustrates conflicts between different religions, particularly old traditions in conflict with newer traditions, Japanese horror merges elements of Shinto and Buddhism seamlessly. There really is no religious conflict depicted on screen. Class explorations are less prevalent in Japanese horror unless there is a historic setting that's been featured due to the country's record low levels of income inequality. In terms of gender, there's much discussion of the representation of onryo, or vengeful female ghosts, such as Sadako and Kayako. On one hand, these women have a lot of agency, but as many have pointed out, it only comes in death and really serves to illustrate some of society's ills in terms of domestic violence, for example, murder, all of which would fall under kegare, uncleanliness, and not to blame the victim, but to be seen as a transgression that is an ill in society and needs to be addressed. A lot of these films do tackle societal issues such as missing children, domestic violence, and suicide, but I think that civil society is much more instrumental in bringing those themes to the fore rather than religion. There's not a lot in Shinto or Japanese Buddhist, but especially in Shinto text, which once again recall that the majority of the country identifies as being affiliated with Shinto, and there's very little written in terms of, for example, homosexuality, which was frowned upon in the Meiji era and post-war Japan, but was actually at times encouraged in very specific regions in older histories that predate the Meiji period. But this is specific to male homosexuality. Unfortunately, like in many cultures, it feels as if female sexuality never existed. There's no written record of this that we know of. But in any case, male samurai, for example, were absolutely permitted to enter into homosexual relationships, but this varied greatly according to historic period and also region. Today, Japan is not a particularly progressive country, unfortunately, with regards to LGBTQ+, but support among the general population is growing. I think that horror film, unlike the West, has been very, very slow to illustrate some of these stories of the LGBTQ+ community, their own stories, as well as violence against members of the LGBTQ+ community. Um, However, the video game genre, it's interesting to note, might be a little bit more forward thinking. For example, the game Ghost of Tsushima revisits feudal Japan and male homosexuality. The Missing, which is another game, features a principal transgender character. So I think what's really happening is that Japanese horror cinema is used to explore concepts of what it considers societal ills in terms of certain types of violence, but that civil society is also there imposing its certain value and particularly conservative values that aren't necessarily outlined in the religious teachings of Shinto or Buddhism. So supernatural horror in Japan, for me, reinforces a Japanese spiritual worldview in the face of globalization. They are encouraging certain practices that would allow one to avoid kegare and to reestablish that balance that is so key in Shinto beliefs. I know we could spend a whole year discussing these films and religious practices, but I hope that's provided a brief overview to some of the themes that you might look for when watching wonderful Japanese supernatural horror. Thank you very much. Thanks again to Dr. Hurst.